folks, let's get started. This is really going to be a lightning round. I'm Korin, co-director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. Very happy to be here. And let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. To my right is Patrick Ho. He is the director, the chairman of the China Energy Fund Committee. He has a very colorful past, including being a ophthalmological surgeon, a concert violinist, and in the past, Home Secretary for Hong Kong. So a Renaissance man in the true sense of the word. To my very far left, is Jim Woolsey. Some of you may know him as the former CIA director. Some of you may know him as the godfather of the Predator drone. I know him as one of the earliest and most dedicated fighters for energy security and for fuel competition, not just in the US, but around the world. Right? And I want to mention he's, of course, co-chair of the US Energy Security Council. Next to him is Shaul Meridor, who's Director General of the Ministry for Infrastructure, Energy, and Water Resources. And before that, you were at the Finance Ministry here in Israel. And I'm going to pick on you about the report that just came out this week, so be prepared. The natural gas report. And right next to him is Matt Terrell, who is Deputy Director of the Argonne National Laboratory, the Science Division, right? And you are also you also manage the Institute for Molecular Engineering at Chicago University, was a joint project with Argonne, right? Yep. So, very interesting people, and let's get started. You know, this is I wouldn't call it a low oil price environment, but definitely a moderate oil price environment. And when we think about fuel competition, we of course are focusing on the transportation fuel market, on the fuel tank or the battery or what have you, competitors to gasoline and diesel over the fuel tank, what is today the fuel tank. And that moderate low price environment of course creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities, right? A lot of opportunities for creative destruction. Companies that may not be able to cut it and fuels that may not be able to cut it in a low oil price environment or a moderate oil price environment. I think the first question I'm going to address to you, Jim, which is prices are moderate. Why should we still care about fuel competition? Why should we still care about energy arbitrage and reducing the strategic importance of oil?
Because presumably at least some policymakers in this area can see beyond the end of their nose. There is a long history of cycles, of course, in the oil business. And if we use every opportunity to try to move oil into a situation where it has to compete, it doesn't get to take advantage of being part of a cartel. I hate to sound like Cato, Carthage must be destroyed, but OPEC must be destroyed. If you look at Gal and Annie's book on oil, turning oil into salt, you see that Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and Annie? Who am I trying to think of?
Adam Smith?
Adam Smith. All effectively echoed Cato with respect to cartels, saying cartels are the worst thing for the economy, and it's the first job of government to destroy them. We can't mince words. We can't fiddle around. We need to use every opportunity, including relatively low-priced oil, to try to bring that about.
I think especially if we see what's happening in the Middle East today, where you have this kind of competition between, for supremacy over the Muslim world with, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, and two of those powers are major energy powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia. None of them are, let's say, friends of the civilized world, though some of them may be temporary allies at certain times. But their power basically derives from oil. And as long as oil is a strategic commodity, they're the ones that are in the catbird seat, or in the driver's seat of the global economy.
Yes. Good news for consumers is bad news for Iran, for Russia, for Venezuela, and that should not be our problem. We actually need to have bad news for those countries.
Well, I'm going to turn to you, Patrick. You know, we heard kind of the German view, which is a very forward-looking view and integrates, I think really looks, takes a very environmental perspective, let's put it that way, a very futuristic perspective on what the transportation fuel market would look like now. Germany is a very wealthy country. Europe, especially Northern Europe, is very wealthy. China is a developing country. It's becoming wealthier. People are becoming wealthier. There's a burgeoning middle class that's probably bigger than the entire population of the United States, but there's still a ways to go, right?
That's right.
And if we look at India and the rest of the developing world, there's a ways to go. When you look at the fuel tank of the car, how important is cheap fuel? How important are fuels made from coal, from natural gas, from other resources?
It's very important indeed. As you all know, China is growing, and its middle class is also growing too. By that, meaning that people want to own cars. And actually, the car market is one of the most prosperous one in the world. And the cars is growing up by a couple of millions every year. So if you traveled ever to Beijing or Shanghai, you can see the whole city is congested with so full of cars and with all the emission and all the ills that comes with having a lot of cars too. So having clean fuels is very important for China. But for China, we have been putting a lot of efforts into researching for renewable fuels. But unlike in the 80s and the 90s when all the renewables initiatives were coming from the government and with subsidies, nowadays in 2010 and also coming to today, the renewables are coming not from the governments, not from the subsidies, but from the industries. Because in China, we all know that China has a lot of coal, very little oil, and no gas. Coal is what we have, and China is one of the largest coal consumers in the whole world. And coal is something we have. Coal is something that is cheap. Coal is something that we will use.
For fuel also.
For fuel
for
also,
transportation fuel.
because in China we can turn coal into methanol. And we have been using methanol for decades. Very little known facts in the world. And nowadays in China, the gasoline is invariably mixed with methanol, to the ratio of 85 to 15 to 75 to 25, and so on and so forth. And we have been accumulating a lot of experience of mixed fuels and using coal, turning to methanol, and using methanol as alternative fuels, and very effectively so. So it is very important for us to use coal and to turn it into clean fuels.
So you're saying that Fiat, with its, you'll hear from them tomorrow afternoon, but they're going to have a very interesting market waiting in China.
Absolutely, because we have a lot of experience in using methanol, and now that we know that methanol, with very little adjustment to the internal combustion engine, we can use methanol very effectively, and even with very little modification. And we all know that with methanol, and we have a very clean engines, and also a very clean emissions as well.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit about the role of the central government, the provincial governments, and how important the regulatory process is as opposed to the companies and all this. But before that, I want to jump to a regulator over here. So a report came out this week in Israel kind of criticizing the government for, let's say, 8 years of dilly-dallying with the natural gas. Natural gas, while it's an important fuel for electricity, is also a tremendously important fuel for the transportation sector, both if it's used directly as CNG, if it's converted to electricity in electrified vehicles, or if it's converted to liquid fuel like methanol, like what Patrick was talking about. So it's enormously important for the transportation sector. What are the lessons that you can take from this report going forward? How does the regulator, how does the government apparatus need to think about industry in a way that helps move things forward and break down barriers rather than creating uncertainty and obstacles to investment and competition?
Well, in the gas sector in Israel, I think we've had great years, and the last years were a bit rougher. And from that point of view, we have to understand that in Israel there was no gas sector at all until a few years ago. And of course, as every sector starting to evolve. It takes time. It has a lot of barriers, and then the government or the regulators could all choose ways. It could either help or put more barriers. I think what we learned from the 6 years that this report talked about was already learned and even implemented in the last budget decisions in the government, and that is that the government in Israel has to put a lot of money and effort to help the gas sector evolve and do it in the right way. So it could be not only for the massive industries, but also for transportation. What we did is put 65 million shekels in helping the not the gas sector, but the fuel sector turn their stations into gas stations. We'll put some hundreds of millions of shekels in the distribution of gas to get the gas to the gas stations. And then what we'll see, we hope, is major movement towards gas, towards CNG mostly, of the public transportation, the heavy vehicles. And after that, of course, the regular vehicles will follow. What we also have is the electric cars. We had the Better Place in Israel. It didn't work. I think maybe they came out, 6 or 7 years too early. But today, when we look at the prices of batteries, etc., I think we can look at the electricity as a fuel for cars in Israel. It's something that in 10 years we'll see here very frequently, and we have to get ready. We have to get the electricity distribution system ready to get more cars on electricity. You have to understand that it's not that everyone could do whatever he wants. Once you have a lot of electric cars, you have to have the distribution system ready for that. And this is the things we're going to do in the coming few years. So I hope 6 years from now when we sit here, you'll say we still learned the lesson. So we'll see.
Just one thing, I actually drove a Better Place car, and I want to say a fantastic car, fantastic technologies. Whatever problem were with the company were, I think, financial problems that were unrelated to the excellent car.
I think today it's even more economical. So when you look at batteries in the world of Tesla, etc., you see that the prices are going down. And if you see, Bloomberg, etc., you can see that prices will go down rapidly in the next decade. So it's only a matter of time. So we'll see a lot of electric cars in Israel.
Okay, but I want to challenge you and push back a little bit on one thing, because you spoke you gave a very futuristic-looking commentary, which is very important. What you're doing with respect to CNG, how you see electric vehicles developing, and so forth. What the government is doing about that. In many cases, government and the regulators especially, and let's say parliamentary uncertainty and so forth, act as an obstacle to investment and innovation. So what are the things that need to be done to overcome that? And I think, the Fuel Choices Initiative in Israel is about smoothing the way for fuel competition and kind of harmonizing regulations across the different departments so companies aren't facing many different obstacles from each different administrative department. But the general outlook.
So I think in the R&D sector, Israel is one of the better places to be in. And in that perspective, I can say that our ministry is putting tens of millions of shekels on R&D in the various places of energy to transportation and to others. And I think from the R&D perspective, Israel is very convenient. This initiative and many others help R&Ds to the technological companies in the first stages to be in a place where I think most of the world they can't be in. I think our problem is not on the R&D sector. The problem in Israel is, once it's commercialized, how do you put obstacles down and not put them up? They say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We have 8 million of them, many opinions. And I think one of eventually it's our job to take all opinions in one room and say, okay, everyone has its jurisdiction. Everyone can say that they put more barriers. And our, I think, job, and it's a very complicated job, is to get all these people in one room and understand that if, let's say we're talking about the gas sector, if we won't work together, if we won't understand that all regulators together have to have eventually one goal, to make a gas sector flourish in Israel. If it will happen, then we'll overcome that. If every regulator will take, only look at its own jurisdiction, it will be hell for industry.